We are happy to have Dr. Tom Mullen from Earlham School of Religion as our morning speaker. He is presently professor of creative writing and preaching at the Earlham School of Religion. He has been at Earlham since 1966 and has served as dean of that school. He is a graduate of Earlham College, divinity degree from Yale University, and in 1959 earned a Doctor of Letters degree from Warner Pacific College. Tom has authored 11 books, of which the latest one is in the bookstore. It is entitled Living Longer and Other Sobering Possibilities. Just before the service this morning, I was talking to Tom, and I asked him if this was his last book, and he said he certainly hoped not. It is the current book. I remember Tom from probably 25 years ago. He spent a weekend at our local church in a seminar-type arrangement, and he had just finished his book, When Two or Three Are Gathered Together, Someone Spills the Milk. It was entirely appropriate because our kids did that every other meal. This was at a time when our children were very impressionable, and our son picked that up, and it made an indelible impression upon him. He is now a Brethren pastor in Virginia and has most of Tom's books in his library and refers to them in many of his sermons.
Thanks very much. I'm pleased to be here. I suppose you'd be surprised if I came and said I wasn't pleased to be here. But I am for several reasons. One, my close relationship with Brethren has gotten even closer because Brethren House, which is connected with Bethany, is next door to where we live. And the people who have been the residents there, wonderful people, really delight in taking care of others. And I'm a person who loves being taken care of. So we've had a very happy relationship. And we've been greeting each other and enjoying reestablishing a relationship. So that's one of the reasons I'm glad to be here. The second reason I'm glad to be here is that in coming over yesterday afternoon on 40, some of you made that trip. You go through a tunnel which is not well lighted, and all of a sudden I was in there and literally had problems seeing and wavered over the center line, at which point a car started to pass driven by a Baptist, and there was a honking of horns and a screeching of tires. So when I say I'm glad to be here, what I mean is I'm glad to be anywhere at this particular point. But for those of you who are from this area, it's also nice to report how friendly the drivers are. The man that was driving the car that I almost hit yelled encouragement to me. In fact, the fellow who was with him even pointed the way. So and then last night we enjoyed the evening program, and then because we're staying at a motel in Maggie Valley, that's the name, we had to leave in the middle of the rainstorm. So I got in the rainstorm, and when I was out there, that road up there was literally flooded. I couldn't see, drove off the road, punctured my tire, and with the help of a policeman and Mary Sue Rosenberger, who was taking pity on me, changed the tire, and it taught me an important lesson as a Quaker hanging out with brethren. When it comes to water, don't mess around with the brethren. Now, in my effort to build rapport, I should say that I wasn't always a Quaker. I joined because I heard that's where the big money was. Very bad mistake, in case you're tempted. But I was brought up in the Christian church, and I've been immersed, for those of you who are interested in that. Then I worked for a few years with the Congregational Church, and they sprinkle. And now I'm a Quaker, which uses no water baptism at all. So I have triple coverage at this point. As we like to say, who are friends, we've been dipped, dabbed, and dry cleaned. But this is a wonderful event. And then the last reason why I want to say up front, I'm really glad to be here. Since Bethany has come to Richmond and we've become partners with them at Earlham School of Religion, we who are friends have had the opportunity to experience the joy of singing. And then last night, when you folks were singing, I think maybe we made a mistake when I made that move. Maybe we should have become brethren. But I can't sing, and I've never met a brethren who can't. So is that a requirement? That's one of the questions that I have to know. But as a person who can't sing but hears well, it was beautiful. And you folks may not even know what a delight you provide for others with your great attention to music. But enough of that. Aging is a lot like gossip. It tells on us. I read an article some years ago, which is the only article on metabolism I've ever read, and when I'm done talking about it, you will know as much as I know. But what I learned about metabolism, the process of living and breathing and growing and changing, what I learned about metabolism is that it's divided into two parts. The first part is good. It's anabolism. That's what little children experience after they're born. Almost every day they get bigger and better and stronger. They grow hair, they have pink cheeks, they're learning to talk, they're learning to walk, they're doing all kinds of things. That's good. The process reverses itself much earlier, this article said, than I had supposed. The process of catabolism, the wearing out process, begins as early as 25. And by the time the people get to be your age and my age, catabolism is sometimes running out of control. And all kinds of signs show up. I made some notes about some of these. One of the interesting facts is that the pigment in your hair, which gives you brown hair or black hair or red hair, is replaced in many cases by air. And I have an authority very close to home, completely white hair. I think it's ironical. I'm now 62 and I'm more of an airhead than I've ever been in my life. Other parts of your body begin to deteriorate, and I'm not commenting, I'm just reporting the facts. Varicose veins show up many times earlier, sometimes later. I was with my grandson this past spring at a beach, and he became fascinated with my legs. And on the way down to the location where we were, he had been learning how to read a map. And this child drew a comparison between the road map and my legs. And when you're a Quaker, a member of the religious society, friends, and I would guess that this holds true for brethren as well, you can't beat your children or your grandchildren. It's a terrible handicap in child rearing. When my own son was growing up, he frustrated me so badly, a time or two, I took him over to my brother-in-law, who's a Lutheran. And if these things haven't happened to us yet, waiting for us over the horizon, or perhaps we should say over the hill, are gallstones and arthritis, being able to see less clearly, sagging jowls. The memory begins to go. And I learned from this article there are 3 things in your memory that go first. Can't think what they are right now, but that's a characteristic of aging that goes with the circumstances. And for many of us, we go through some serious kinds of illness. One of the reasons I believed this article to be true was that when I was 35, I discovered I was a diabetic. Now, there are probably other diabetics here. Let's see, how many people here are diabetics? Several people are. And I've tried to make a career out of talking about this illness. Why not talk about it if it's going to be with you anyway? And it is a wonderful disease to work into conversation. All you have to do is not eat dessert, and somebody's always sitting there wanting your dessert, saying, "Oh, are you on a diet?" And I say, "No, my pancreas doesn't work." And then for several minutes I can dominate table conversation with my diabetes. It's one of the best diseases to talk about that I know. Now, I have to be honest, being a diabetic isn't all a piece of cake. There are problems with it, and the worst problem I found with it is that I might be at a table, dominating table conversation, the center of attention, which is what we egomaniacs want, and somebody else may be sitting there and want to talk about his or her illness. I was teaching one summer at Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis. We had classes every day, then we had lunch and adjourned after lunch every day. Every day I dominated table conversation with my diabetes, one of the best summer schools I have ever taught. But about the fourth day I was on a roll. I think I was talking about types of insulin. If some of you can stay afterwards, I've made arrangements for a slide of my pancreas to be shown, and I do an illustrated lecture. But I was on a roll there, and the students seemed really interested, hanging on my every word. But one man was sitting there, and when I was talking about my illness, he interrupted me. And he said, "I've had open heart surgery." Well, there's a hierarchy of illnesses. Now, diabetes is ahead of a lot of stuff. It really is. It's ahead of hernias. So if you've had a hernia, enjoy the hernia. But let's be clear, diabetes outranks hernias. Are we clear about that? In fact, some of you may live in the Indianapolis area. If you go around Indianapolis on 465, there's a big billboard-sized sign advertising a hernia hospital. You can run down and get your hernia fixed. And every time I go by it, I say, second rate, second rate. But open heart surgery is right there at the top of the heap. And I kid you not. He not only took the center of attention away from me, at one point he stood up, took off his shirt, and showed that big scar that you get with open heart surgery. I've never seen such a bore in my entire life. And it bothered me a lot because, wouldn't you know, the only surgery I'd ever had was the kind you can't talk about in public. Well, I will, because older persons are at least regarded as mature and can handle these things. But a few years before, the only surgery I'd ever had was a hemorrhoidectomy. And a hemorrhoidectomy is really hard to work into conversation. And you surely don't show the scars. But the worst part of it is, it gets no respect. People think it's funny. When I was recuperating from the surgery in Methodist Hospital in Indianapolis, face down, people would come and they would find out what my illness was. And as some of you know, it's a training school for clinical pastoral education. So I had a lot of chaplains in training who came to visit me. And we had one woman who was very sensitive, very caring, but she had evidently come from a class in which she used a lot of we language. How are we today? Have we voided today? I thought that was really nothing I wanted to discuss with her. And finally she said, "Oh, well, have we had surgery?" And I said, "I can't speak for you. I have." And finally she said, "Well, what kind of surgery have you had?" I said, "I've had a hemorrhoidectomy." There was this pause, this silence. I thought maybe she was a Quaker. And then, wanting to be helpful but not knowing what to say, she finally says, "I suppose you're glad that's all behind you now." Well, My brother, my own flesh and blood brother, sent me a get well card. I appreciated that because he knew I was in pain, and so he sent me this get well card. So I opened it up, and on the front of it was a picture of two Eskimos. And there was a question at the bottom that asked, do you know what Eskimos get who sit around their igloos all day? So I turned over and said, Polaroids. Well, that's why when I was sitting there and this guy was talking about open heart surgery, I didn't even bring it up because it has no respect. Well, the good news is that finally, a few years ago, I had some big league surgery. And those of you who have had open heart surgery, come on up. I want to talk. Because 5 years ago, I had my colon removed. I have an ileostomy. Some of you know what that is. After you remove your colon, they pull a piece of your small intestine through a hole in your stomach, and then they glue a plastic bag to take the place of your colon. Aren't you glad we haven't eaten for some hours? And it was a life-threatening illness, and I nearly joined that great big Quaker meeting in the sky. But when I was recuperating once again in Methodist Hospital in Indianapolis, a woman who treated me and took care of me was an ostomy nurse. And Pam is a wonderful human being. And she had as part of her responsibility to answer any questions that I might have, and I had a ton of them. So I said to her one day, Pam, tell me something about how you got into being an ostomy nurse. And then she said, well, she was 35, married, had 2 kids, worked full-time as an ostomy nurse, and she had had an ileostomy since she was 12 years old. So when I started whining, wimping around, she would have none of it. And at one point I said, Pam, you know, I'm concerned about this plastic bag that I have to glue to my stomach. What happens if someday I'm down at Lake Junaluska talking to 1,000 brethren and the bag breaks? I thought that was a legitimate concern. She didn't miss a beat. She said, if that happens, make sure you're standing downwind. Well, as I was savoring that thought, she went on and said, besides, it's much harder for a woman who has an ileostomy than it is a man. And I said, explain that. I don't see the difference. She said, well, both men and women wear those bags, but a woman has to find shoes to match. Well, her point was well taken. And it's the point that I'm trying to make today. In life, if we live a while, if we age, we're going to start falling apart. We're going to start wearing out. Things are going to break. We're going to have surgery. We're going to lose loved ones. That goes with the territory. And what Pam modeled for me was that you learn to do the best you can, try to take care of your health, and then you accept whatever happens, which is as much grace as you can muster. And that's one of the reasons why, as I grow older, I'm glad I've had some history at least of something resembling the Christian faith, because that is the message that enables us to grow older and age and have physical problems and not feel that somehow we have lost our usefulness or somehow feel that that means that God is picking on us. We know it goes with the territory. So it's important that we practice the stewardship of taking care of ourselves. I'm married to a woman, bless her heart, who has tried hard for these last years of our marriage to take care of me. We went through this period of time in which she wanted me to live longer by eating oat bran. And I ate a lot of oat bran, and I don't know to this day whether it extends your life, but it sure seems longer when you eat a lot of oat bran. And she also has been a diabetic for 50 years. Did I mention to you that I was a diabetic? And would practice a regimen of exercise and good diet. I don't think that's self-centered, because if we take the biblical idea seriously that we're our bodies are the temple of God, then taking care of the temple is what we're called to do. That's not self-centered. Now, it also means that we can become paranoid, and we can become people who worry about nothing but our health, or we can do what a lot of men my age and even younger do. We can't accept the fact we're growing older, so we fantasize and try to have affairs with younger women. That never was a possibility for me, and even the possibility is joking. It's a laugh, because that is not where true living occurs. It's when we accept our age and accept who we are and do the best we can with what we've got left, that we learn to be good stewards of our bodies and ourselves. That's point one for those who are taking notes. Point two, we learn, if we're fortunate, and many here have experienced this and are experiencing it today, and others know what I'm talking about, even though you may have lost your loved one. We learn that one of the realities of growing older is we learn more and more about caring for one another. When one is young, we're usually so much involved in establishing a career or getting launched in some important project. And we assume that because we're in good health, people will take care of themselves. As we get older, I think it's true for most of us that we learn that caring for one another is one of the reasons why, in fact, we live longer. You've known the statistics that married people live longer than single people. And I think one of the reasons is a single person only has to take care of himself or herself. Married people pretty soon learn they have to take care of one another. And those of us who have been fortunate enough to be married a long time, and Nancy and I just last weekend celebrated 38 years of happiness together. We've been married 39 years, but one of the years wasn't too happy. Actually, it wasn't a whole year. It was a day here, a week there. But in that time, we've learned what probably the majority of the people in this room have learned, namely, that along the way, we learn to live for another person. We learn to take care of one another. I learned this several years ago when I hadn't intended to. It happened that my wife, in one of her efforts to be young, had gone ice skating with our grandson. And she, of course, fell and broke her right arm, and she's a right-handed person. And when the doctor got done, she had it in a cast that had it bent at the elbow. She looked as if she were perennially waving at people. Well, because she's a right-handed person, that was a very stiff cast. I had to do a lot of the things that in my life with her I had not had to do before, include dressing her and bathing her. That had some fun aspects to it. But I learned something that I had never been aware of before that point. I have decided that the people who design women's clothes really hate women. Else, why do they design them with so many things that have to button in the back? Why do they design shoes that you have to have a strap on a certain way or the thing will fall off when you walk? And the biggest problem for me, which I had to help share in the care of Nancy, that I will never forget and hope never to have to repeat again, was on those occasions when she dressed up to go out, helping her put on pantyhose. Now, when I was first confronted with that opportunity, I thought, this should be no big deal. They're just long, thin socks, aren't they? So I thought, I'll put them on her feet and then yank them up. No, you don't do that, and particularly when you put them on the wrong feet to begin with. It really makes it a lot harder. And also, she found my efforts to be somewhat entertaining. And when she laughed, she would throw her arm and bonk me in the head with her cast. But what we learned in that time is what is the heart of life together. We get to the place in which we learn to take care of one another. And that's really, in the family setting, what most of us do in the church setting over and over again. Nancy and I last year went through some terrible health problems. You will hear about all of mine. But actually, Nancy's were much worse. In fact, Today is the 4th of September. Tomorrow will be the 5th of September. A year ago tomorrow, she had her left leg amputated, and we went through this terrible, depressing period of time. We were both in the hospital at the same time. We were both diabetics. Did I mention that I was a diabetic? And in the diabetic ward of Methodist Hospital, she was in one room with a wall in between, and I was on the other room. She couldn't walk, so I was able to walk and feeling a little better, so I got up about 10 o'clock at night to go in and see my wife of those many years of married life together, and walked in. However, the charge nurse did not know that we were husband and wife. So she came and pulled me out of her bed, and we do have our fantasies, but during this time when she was ill and I was ill, we experienced that which, in my way of thinking, is the heart of a church. If churches don't do what I'm about to describe, then in my opinion, they're hard-pressed to maintain the credentials of being a Church of Jesus Christ. The way in which we were cared for and loved and ministered to by people in our congregation. If we don't learn anything else as we grow older, I think we learn the importance of being brothers and sisters in Christ, not just within our family, but caring for us and taking ourselves seriously. And I'm not able to give a speech on whether or not prayer works or not, but I know when I was a pastor, I used to go to hospitals and deal with terminally ill people, and I'd pray for them, and they died. And I went through a period of time in which I wondered, does prayer make any difference? I think about it entirely differently now, because we were the recipients of prayer. And when you've been prayed for, that's a much different experience, I think, than praying for someone else. And there were so many people praying for me that I felt almost obligated to get well. And when Nancy was in the hospital, she taught a Sunday school class for a number of years, and all of her Sunday school class kids sent her homemade get well cards. Totally predictable, made out of construction paper, and the same message, "Dear Mrs. Mullen, please get well," except for one card that one of her kids, who was her Dennis the Menace, sent to her. And he put on the card, "Dear Mrs. Mullen, get well or I'll beat you up." He'd been brought up a Lutheran. And that card was worth a day in the hospital. And at $212 a day, I wish he'd sent more of them. We experience the care of being loved and being taken seriously and people concerned about us. As I mentioned earlier, we live next door to Brethren House. And those people cared for us. They mowed our grass, and they swept off the grass that they had mowed, and they trimmed the bushes, and they did favor after favor for us. And it was just as normal as breathing. And that makes so much difference in our lives when we know we're cared and we're loved for. When we have a kind of cause and effect understanding of deeds done for another, we may miss the point that what is really important is not that the grass gets mowed or the food is brought in. It's what it represents. It represents caring and concern, and people can say, "We're with you as you walk through this valley," even though that doesn't help you get over your illness necessarily. But can you imagine going through all this stuff that you and I have been through and not feeling cared for or taken seriously or loved? That would be awful. And I'm not sure younger people can really understand that as well as old coots like you and me. I think we have to have walked through some valleys. We have to bend by the bedsides of a few people, and we have to go through some hard things ourselves to be able to experience the reality that we love one another, and we show it by caring for one another. Third point. Even though we're getting older, and I've heard 2 or 3 references that speak to this, even though we're getting older, I think it's a mistake to assume that getting older means you're getting grouchier or having more of a sour personality. Now, I know some old people who are grouchy, but they were grouchy when they were 25. Getting older didn't make them grouchy. Getting older didn't make them sour. They felt that way a long time before. And if there's one message from the New Testament that I really want to hold up at this point, it's the belief that we must become like children if we would enter the kingdom. And part of what that means is having a childlike attitude towards life. And children never have to be taught when to laugh. You only have to teach a child when not to laugh. They'll laugh at a train wreck unless the train hits them. And then as they grow older and they go to school and the teacher says, stop that giggling, they learn that you're not free to laugh on any occasion. But fortunately, and there are several people here I know who have caught this disease, fortunately, many people never outgrow that ability to look at life and find joy and laughter in it. Many times in a family, one of the children is the one who is the party clown. We have 4 children, and our second daughter, Martha, is the one among our 4 who was always into mischief. She was the one that when they get together today, the other kids expect her to entertain them. She loved to do things that would get her sisters and her brother in trouble. When she was a senior in college, she went into Phi Beta Kappa. Notice how I worked into the speech that I have a smart kid. And we went there to celebrate her initiation, and they invited a person to speak on that occasion who talked about archaeology. He talked for 1 hour and 47 minutes, almost as long as I'm going to talk today. And you can understand what he was thinking. Everybody there is smart. They weren't all. The students were. The parents were. Some were and some weren't. But he decided he had a captive audience, so he droned on and on and on. Well, they were all grown-ups. They were all civilized, and they did what grown-up, civilized people do. They stared at the speaker as if they were interested. But they weren't interested. I was sitting in a place where I could see the eyes of a lot of people, and a glazed look had come over them. I see it here today. People wondering, when will this be over? Well, halfway through the speech, Martha wrote something on her paper napkin and slipped it over in front of me. And I determined not to look because I knew it was some kind of smart remark. And I knew that if I read it, I would lose what self-control I had left. But I have to read notes. Some people have to answer telephones. I have to read notes. So I glanced down, and Martha had written, "Dad, don't even think about going to the bathroom." Well, for the last hour of that speech, I could think of nothing else. And finally, mercifully, when the speech was over, we went out into a courtyard and we must have laughed for 20 minutes. It was the best part of the evening. Laughter is a gift from God, and our ability to laugh enables us to cope with a lot of otherwise painful experiences. And I think it's an expression of faithfulness, because when we're able to laugh in a world like ours, it's a way of saying that ultimately we think God is still in control, that ultimately we have the freedom to laugh. Otherwise, we'd have only despair, only regrets out there. And so that childlike attitude of being able to laugh doesn't go out of favor just because we get older. In fact, I would even argue that when you get older, we may have an opportunity to lose some of our inhibitions. We may be able to laugh about some things that we weren't able to do when we were in different circumstances. I'm no longer dean of Earlham School of Religion. I don't have to laugh at the jokes of some of our big donors anymore. Sorry to bring that up, Teresa, but and I was on a program one time to give the prayer. It was at the retirement party for Landrum Bowling, who had been president of the college for a number of years, and he was a very important man in the world of higher education. And so a retired university president, who was a close friend of his, had come to give a speech, and there were hundreds of people in the dining hall. And I happened to be placed next to this man, who was a delightful dinner companion. He regaled us with stories. He was hilarious. Retired university president. I won't give you his name because what he did that I will never forget was that while we were talking and he was telling one of his stories, he took his crackers, crunched them up in his hand, put them in his milk glass, and then slurped the concoction. And we were sitting on the dais up in front of 700 people. And I thought, oh, I hope someday I can be old enough or rich enough to be able to do what I want to do. I hope that aging frees us from the sin that so many young people commit, namely of taking ourselves too seriously. I hope as we age we can enjoy each other's company. Among the reasons why I married the woman that I did was that she always laughed at my stuff. And we were married for 3 years before I realized she laughed at everybody's stuff. And I think that something great happens when we're able to enjoy the company of one another. Now, you can do a whole class, and maybe in one of the humor workshops somebody will deal with this. You can laugh at people, and you can hurt people with humor. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the way in which we share life together, laughing at our own foibles. When I was a young man, I was invited to give a speech out in Boston to a bunch of folks, and everybody else on the program in the world of organized religion was already famous. Franklin Wallen was on the program. He was a well-known church historian, and all the intellectuals had come to hear Franklin Littell. Sorry, not Franklin Wallen, Franklin Littell. And William Stringfellow was there. Remember the Episcopal attorney who was so controversial in the peace movement? And Richard Halverson, who was then chaplain of the United States Senate, was on the program. And Tom Mullen, pastor of the Newcastle, Indiana Friends Meeting, whatever that was. Oh, it was heady stuff. And this was my chance to shine. This is my chance to do a really good job because it's the most important event to which I'd ever been invited until today. Well, the person who was presiding was himself well known, and probably some of you have his books. Bruce Larson. Bruce introduced the other speakers. Each was to do 5 minutes, and then we were to break into small groups and all the rest. Well, each of the 3 speakers did his thing, got rounds of applause, and finally, by a process of elimination, I was next. And as the Bible says, I girded up my loins, I pulled up my pants, and Bruce forgot I was on the program. But I knew I was to speak next. My name was on the program, and I felt my body was still there. And enough people were looking down, pointing, and said, I wonder why the other guy is there. And he realized he'd made a mistake, so he tried to correct and said, I'm so sorry. I forgot to introduce our 4th speaker, Mr. Tim Miller. There was the story of my life. First he forgot me, and then he mispronounced my name. I got up, I stumbled through my 5 minutes, I went back to the hotel, climbed into bed, assumed the prenatal position, and chewed on the corner of the blanket the rest of the evening. That was to be my day to shine, and it was a downer. And I came away saying that wasn't a good experience at all. It could have been a great day for a young guy, but it was a downer. But for those of you who want to know the rest of the story, a few years later, after I'd gone to Earlham, Bruce Larson was invited to come and speak. When I heard that, I said, may I introduce him? And you know you always get the job for which you volunteer. So I got up, told that story without identifying, and said, it's my pleasure to be our speaker today, Mr. Bryce Learson. But here's the point. Bruce didn't even remember that first event, and he was right and I was wrong. In life, stuff happens. And I think as we get older, we realize that more, and we don't have to carry around all the hurts and the resentments. We don't have to take things so personally. We can laugh off a lot more stuff than we might have been able to laugh off when we're younger. And having resentment is like burning down your house to get rid of mice. It works, but there's a huge price to pay. And if we can have a sense of the ability to celebrate life as we get older, then I think the hope comes true. Namely, that we celebrate life and our later years are more fun than we could have imagined. Nancy and I last year were given, as a 60th birthday present from our children, a one-way ticket to Hawaii. I was a little worried about that. But almost all the other times we had gone away as a family, it's always been with some Quaker event. And you have to, if you go with Quakers, they don't do it as well as you folks do. You always sleep on the ground and eat granola when you're with Quakers. And so a vacation was always kind of corrupted by, this was the first time we had 2 weeks in Hawaii to enjoy. And one of the things that happened while we were experiencing that trip was that as we were going through it, we found out that we were older people with a set of attitudes that didn't quite click with the free thinking and freedom of Hawaii. For example, we went to Waikiki Beach, probably the most famous stretch of land in America, of sand. And people there seemed to be having a competition to see who could expose the most skin and get most of it tanned. There was a man in a pair of swimming trunks, so I couldn't tell whether he was inside trying to get out or outside trying to get in. And they lie around for hours with these various tin pieces to try to get the reflection just right. So I thought there was a competition going on, and I didn't know what to do, because the way I was brought up, you didn't stare at people of the opposite sex in tiny bathing suits. So I was left with that dilemma. I'm on the beach, but what should I do? So Quakers always compromise. I closed one eye. So if we have more time, and one of the things we hope for when we're older is to have time to travel, time to do things we didn't have time to do before, will we be able to enjoy it? And the answer is yes, if we're able to look at life in such a way that we see it as a gift to be celebrated, and we can enjoy what's been given to us. And that brings me to the last point I want to make today, namely that as we get older, I hope we will have more spiritual maturity than we did when we were younger. Now, I know we're not perfect. Nobody would confuse any of us with perfection. But if we're not better than we were, if we're not more spiritually mature than we were when we were 25, why have we been hearing all those sermons, singing all those hymns, reading the Bible, and praying? It ought to have some kind of a cumulative effect in the way we think about life. And that's why I must confess I've really been pleased and excited as you've talked here and the workshops that you're offering and the 90-year-old man who was videotaped. We're older, but we still have a lot to give. We're not ready to be washed up on the shore just yet. We can have the maturity of doing the right things maybe now for the right reasons. We can have a prayer life that ought to be more powerful than it was when we were younger. And if we spiritually grow to maturity, that means that as we face the ultimate issues of life, and that means death, and that means grief, and that means loss, maybe we'll be able to handle that after all. And some of you who have lost loved ones know the answer to that better than I. We'll be able to handle that and keep it in perspective and celebrate what we've had, while at the same time understanding that Almighty God is still with us. Robert Fulghum, the author of many books, said in a recent interview that was written up that in his work as a hospice chaplain, he discovered something that was really important. He said as hospice people, all of whom were terminally ill, as he discussed life with hospice people, he said not a single person who knew he or she was going to die ever had regrets about work. Nobody ever said, well, I'm going to die in a year. I wish I'd have spent more time at the office. But people have regrets about spending time with children or grandchildren. They have regrets about being insensitive to somebody. If we are persons who are spiritually mature, then we can make those decisions and we can have that relationship with God, which makes it possible for us to deal with the last events of our own lives. Now, why am I talking about that today? Well, partly because we just had these family conversations a few days ago with our own children, talking about our estate and writing a will. How many of you have written wills here? See, tell the age group of our bunch here. And that's so important because then you can be done with it. Now, what my kids discovered was that they just soon for us to live because we don't have much to leave to them. And yet that's a very healthy exercise, because as we talked about that experience, we really weren't talking about the value of things in terms of money. We were talking about if we sold our house to somebody that wouldn't care about what we've done, and it's across the street from Bethany and ESR, would that house be used the way it had been used? All those students spilling things on our rug? Or would we somehow give up part of our history that's very important? We have a cottage in northern Indiana, and I sat in all the rooms of that cottage just a few days ago, turned completely around, and finally, after 20 years, didn't see anything I had to fix. And it has all kinds of memories. You can always dispose of property, but property has meaning in terms of what's going on there. And how do you try to pass that along? And that's the harder question. But if we're spiritually mature, hopefully we won't make the mistake of thinking that things are what we leave. It isn't things that we leave. It's values, it's principles, it's faith. And if we can be remembered for those things, then whatever possessions we have simply fall into place. So we quit talking about it, and we've never found an issue too big to run from in our family. And the will have to be done another time. But it was educational because it reminded us that as we're nearer to the end than we are the beginning of life, we need to make sure we know what things are really important. Let me quote one of our guys, Stephen Grillette, who has a statement that's been so widely published that people don't even know that this guy was a Quaker. But this is what he wrote many years ago. He says this: "I shall pass through this world but once. Any good thing I can do or any kindness I can show to any human being, let me do it now. I shall pass through this world but once." You know that, and I know that. And part of our task is to be role models for all these other generations so that they can come to understand that it's not the stuff that's important, it's the people who are important and the lives that they live, and that can be our finest and best legacy. So we want to live longer, but we don't want to live longer if we can't live better. And by living better, I mean in that sense of being more faithful stewards of the time that God has given us. Let me conclude with a quotation from Victor Hugo. To be very candid, I find that speeches I make have a tendency to lack class and dignity. But if you put in a quotation right at the end from a famous person, it gives it one shot at respectability. Now, I know several of you well, and I'm not certain how big a deal dignity is here. And being a Quaker, like Richard Nixon, I always tell the truth. So you should know that I haven't read everything that Victor Hugo has written. Actually, I got this quotation off the calendar. But it's a great quotation, and he says what I've said in more words but with less value, this point. Victor Hugo wrote, "Have patience for the small tasks and courage for the great ones. And when your long day's work is over, lie down peacefully and go to sleep. God is awake." To me, that says we got all this stuff to deal with. We got to earn a living. We got to take care of ourselves. And we have those moments in which we make big decisions. But when we're done, all that we can say is we've done the best we can, and then we can retire, or end the day in bed, or die, knowing that Almighty God is still awake, and we can trust the running of the world to the same God that's been in charge all along, and you and I can sleep well. Thanks for having me.
Our thanks to Tom for being with us and giving us some dignifying statements. He has just agreed to be at the Brethren Press bookstore to sign any books that you would like to have. The latest one is there, and I believe some of the others are there. So if you would like to have that, he will be there immediately following this session. Thank you.